Elementi di terra, di mare, dell'aria, camicie nere della rivoluzione e delle legioni, uomini e donne d'Italia, dell'impero e del regno d'Albania, ascoltate. Un'ora segnata dal destino batte nel cielo della nostra patria. L'ora delle decisioni irrevocabili. La dichiarazione di guerra è già stata consegnata agli ambasciatori. Agli ambasciatori di Gran Bretagna e di Francia.
He moved like a storm, sudden, precise, impossible to ignore. Not merely clever, terrifyingly effective. A mind that read crowds as currents and men as maps. Where others bumbled, he found opportunity. Where others hesitated, he acted, and the world rearranged itself around those actions. He turned words into orders, and speeches into motion. A phrase, a gesture, a promise, enough to make the restless stand and follow. He could make outrage sound righteous, and confusion sound inevitable. He built organization out of chaos, ragged veterans, angry workers, drifting youths, all of them braided into a machine that answered to a single will. He saw theater where others saw politics. He knew timing as acutely as tactics. Performance became policy. Certainty became command. There was a cold cleverness to it, a strategist's patience married to a showman's instinct. Greatness, if you call it that, lived in his efficiency, the ability to move millions, to convert grievance into momentum, to turn personal contradiction into authority. But the brilliance was honed on a razor. Every triumph carried a cost. Freedoms eroded, dissent silenced, institutions broken to make room for one story. What made him formidable also made him dangerous. Listen to the cadence, feel the pull. This was a force that remade a broken nation by promise and spectacle, by force of will as much as by policy.
His name is Benito Amilcare Andrea Mussolini.
But before he was Il Duce, he was Benito Amilcare Andrea Mussolini, a name that reads like a manifesto. Born in the tiny Romagnolo village of Predapio, each of his names was a flag planted in opposing soil. Benito, for Mexican revolutionary Benito Juarez. Amilcare and Andrea, nods to Italian anarchist heroes. His identity began as a roll call of rebellion. His father, Alessandro, was a blacksmith and a fierce, self-taught socialist. His life was heat and hammer, speech and pamphlet, a man who believed ideas should burn and rebuild the world. In that workshop, Mussolini learned the language of outrage, the celebration of force and upheaval. Across the threshold stood Rosa Maltoni, his mother, patient, devout, a schoolteacher who kept faith, routine, and discipline as shields against chaos. Where Alessandro forged, Rosa tended. Where one demanded revolt, the other taught restraint. She tried to temper his wildness with prayer and measured lessons. She planted order where fury wanted to grow. That household, furnace and altar, rhetoric and ritual, became the fault line of his life. It produced a man tuned to extremes, able to stoke popular anger and, with equal skill, promise order. The contradiction didn't merely live inside him, it propelled him. It explains the uncanny ability to turn personal conflict into political power. What began as a name and a family argument would become a blueprint for a movement.
On March 23, 1919, in a meeting hall on Milan's Piazza San Sepolcro, the fascist movement was born. It was a strange and motley crew that gathered that day. Fewer than 200 disillusioned socialists, futurist artists who worshipped machines and violence, and fiery young veterans still wearing the black uniforms of the Arditi. There was no grand theory, no coherent doctrine. Their founding program was a chaotic blend of radical nationalism and syndicalist demands, a republic, universal suffrage, an 8-hour workday, and the seizure of church property. But the ideology was secondary. The core of fascism was action, a visceral, violent rejection of the existing order. Their instruments were the squadre d'azione, action squads. These were the black shirts. They were Mussolini's answer to the Red Menace. While the government stood by helplessly as socialist and communist leagues organized massive strikes during the Biennio Rosso, the 2 red years of 1919 to 1920, the black shirts took matters into their own hands. They were organized and led by local chieftains known as Ras, charismatic and often vicious men who commanded absolute loyalty. The violence of the squadristi was systematic and theatrical. A typical action would see a truckload of black shirts roaring into a provincial town in the dead of night. They would descend upon the local socialist club, the cooperative, or the trade union office, armed with heavy wooden clubs called manganelli. They would smash furniture, burn books and red flags, and beat any members they could find. Their signature weapon was not the bullet, but castor oil. They would capture local socialist leaders and force-feed them enormous quantities of the potent laxative, a form of humiliation designed to break a man's spirit and make him a figure of ridicule in his own community. To the socialists, they were murderous thugs. But to the terrified middle classes, the shopkeepers, the small landowners, the professionals, and to the powerful industrialists and agrarian elites, the black shirts were a godsend. They were the brutal but necessary surgeons cutting out the cancer of Bolshevism. They were restoring order. Mussolini, from his editor's desk in Milan, acted as the conductor of this orchestra of violence. He didn't always control the individual Ross, but he provided the ideological justification, glorifying their actions in the pages of his newspaper. He was walking a political tightrope, unleashing a revolutionary force while simultaneously positioning himself as the only man who could control it and bring stability to the nation. He quickly outgrew the movement's radical left-wing origins, shedding the anti-capitalist rhetoric and embracing a platform of hyper-nationalism, social order, and the defense of private property. This pivot won him powerful allies. The money that had trickled in from industrialists now became a flood. The police and the army, who saw the socialists as the greater enemy, often turned a blind eye to black shirt violence, and in some cases even supplied them with weapons. By the autumn of 1922, Mussolini felt the balance of power had tipped. The Fascist Party was now a mass movement with over 300,000 members and a disciplined if unruly militia. The government was on its last legs. The time had come for the ultimate gamble. At a massive party rally in Naples, he stood before a sea of 40,000 cheering blackshirts and threw down the gauntlet. Either the government will be given to us, or we shall seize it by marching on Rome. The march to Rome was one of history's most audacious bluffs. As columns of blackshirts, many armed with little more than farm tools and bravado, began their slow, rain-soaked convergence on the capital, Mussolini remained safely in Milan, ready to flee to Switzerland if the plan failed. The Prime Minister, Luigi Facta, finally awoke to the danger. He pleaded with King Victor Emmanuel III to declare a state of emergency and use the army to disperse the marchers. The army was loyal and vastly superior. It could have swept the fascist columns aside in a matter of hours. But the king was a man paralyzed by indecision. He was small in stature and in spirit, haunted by the fear of a bloody civil war. He worried that the army might not be entirely reliable, that some generals sympathized with the fascists. He imagined a scene of Italians firing on Italians in the streets of Rome, and his nerve broke. He refused to sign the decree. Facta resigned in disgust. The king, seeing no other option, sent a telegram to Milan. It was an invitation for Benito Mussolini to come to Rome and form a government. Mussolini arrived not at the head of a conquering army, but as a first-class passenger on an overnight train. Presenting himself at the Quirinal Palace before the king, still wearing his black shirt, he announced, with calculated humility, "I have come from the battlefield." He had conquered Italy without a fight. The era of fascism had begun.
For the first 2 years, Mussolini played the part of a constitutional prime minister. He led a broad coalition government, paid lip service to parliamentary rules, and worked hard to reassure the old liberal establishment and the international community. He was a whirlwind of energy, holding multiple ministerial posts, working 16-hour days, and projecting an image of dynamic, modern leadership. To many, it seemed the fascist revolution was little more than a changing of the guard, a necessary dose of authoritarian medicine to cure Italy's post-war sickness. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, Mussolini was methodically laying the groundwork for absolute power. His first move was to guarantee a political majority. He pushed through the Acerbo Law, an electoral reform which stipulated that any party gaining the most votes in an election, as long as it was more than 25%, would automatically be awarded 2/3 of the seats in parliament. It was a winner-take-all system designed to legally cement his power. In the 1924 elections, using a campaign of widespread intimidation and violence orchestrated by the Blackshirts, the fascists and their allies won a landslide victory, capturing 65% of the vote. The new parliament was a docile, cowed body, with one notable exception: Giacomo Matteotti. The leader of the small Unitary Socialist Party, Matteotti was a man of immense physical and moral courage. On May 30th, 1924, he rose in the Chamber of Deputies to deliver what would be his final speech. For nearly 2 hours, speaking over a constant barrage of jeers and threats from the fascist benches, he laid bare the systematic fraud and thuggery that had corrupted the election. He read out names, dates, and locations, providing an irrefutable indictment of the regime's criminal nature. It was an act of political suicide, and he knew it. As he concluded, he reportedly told a colleague, "Now you can prepare my funeral oration." Less than 2 weeks later, as he walked along the Tiber River in Rome, a black Lancia sedan pulled up beside him. 5 men, a group of fascist fanatics who constituted Mussolini's personal secret hit squad, jumped out and bundled him into the car. He fought back with incredible ferocity, but was eventually overpowered and stabbed to death.
The bungled kidnapping and murder, followed by the discovery of his body buried in a shallow grave 2 months later, ignited a firestorm. The Matteotti crisis was the greatest challenge of Mussolini's career. The press, still enjoying a measure of freedom, erupted in furious condemnation. The public was horrified by the sheer brutality of the crime. The opposition deputies withdrew from Parliament in a protest known as the Aventine Secession, hoping the king would intervene and dismiss Mussolini. The Duce's government seemed on the verge of collapse. He appeared shaken, feigning ignorance and promising a full investigation. For 6 months, his fate hung in the balance. But his opponents were divided, and the king once again refused to act. As the pressure waned, Mussolini's confidence returned, spurred on by the hardline Ras who urged him to abandon all pretense and crush his enemies. On January 3, 1925, he strode into the now empty parliament and delivered the speech that officially inaugurated the dictatorship. He was no longer defensive, he was defiant. He mocked the opposition and dared them to impeach him. Then came the chilling climax. I declare before this assembly that I and I alone assume the political, moral, and historical responsibility for all that has happened. He was not confessing to the murder itself, but to the creation of the entire system of violence that had made it possible. He ended with a threat. Italy wants peace and quiet, work and calm. I will give these things with love if possible, and with force if necessary. It was a declaration of war on what remained of Italian democracy. Within 2 years, the transformation was complete. A series of laws, the leggi fascistissime, were passed. All other political parties were banned. Free trade unions were abolished. Elected mayors were replaced by centrally appointed officials. Freedom of speech, press, and assembly were eliminated. Anyone suspected of anti-fascist activity could be arrested and held without trial. A new special tribunal for the defense of the state was created to try political offenders, with the death penalty reinstated for crimes against the regime. The state was now an instrument of the fascist party, and the party was an instrument of one man's will.
With his power absolute, Mussolini set about creating the totalitarian state he had long envisioned. His goal was not merely to rule Italy, but to fundamentally remake the Italian people, to transform them from the cynical, individualistic heirs of the Renaissance into a disciplined, militarized people worthy of a new Roman Empire. The tools for this transformation were propaganda and organization. The cult of Il Duce became the state's official religion. His image was inescapable. Photographs depicted him as a master of old trades, a pilot soaring through the clouds, a swordsman dueling with athletic grace, a lion tamer, a writer, a farmer. His speeches were broadcast on the radio into every town square. The Luce Institute produced weekly newsreels, shown in every cinema before the main feature, that presented a carefully curated vision of fascist progress and the Duce's tireless genius. Slogans were emblazoned on buildings everywhere: believe, obey, fight. A minute on the battlefield is worth a lifetime of peace, and the ubiquitous Mussolini is always right. The regime took control of the leisure time of its citizens from cradle to grave. Children were indoctrinated from the age of 6 in the Balilla youth movement, where they wore black-shirted uniforms, marched with miniaturized rifles, and learned chants praising the Duce. The after-work organization, the Dopolavoro, provided ordinary Italians with subsidized holidays, sporting events, and cultural activities, all designed to foster a sense of national community and keep them under the watchful eye of the party. Mussolini launched a series of grand theatrical battles to mobilize the nation. The battle for grain aimed to make Italy self-sufficient in wheat production through the use of modern farming techniques. The battle for land culminated in the draining of the Pontine marshes, a public health and engineering triumph that was celebrated around the world. The battle for births sought to increase the Italian population, with Mussolini rewarding prolific mothers with medals and cash prizes, declaring that numbers are power. These projects were a mixture of substance and illusion. The battle for grain did increase wheat yields, but it did so at the expense of other more valuable crops and ultimately impoverished the South. The new towns in the Pontine marshes were showcases, but they represented only a fraction of the investment needed in rural Italy. Nevertheless, as propaganda, they were wildly successful. They created a powerful narrative of a dynamic, modernizing nation led by a visionary who could make the impossible possible. Perhaps his most cunning achievement was the Lateran Treaty of 1929. For 60 years, since the Italian state had seized Rome from the papacy, the Pope had been a self-declared prisoner in the Vatican, refusing to recognize the legitimacy of the kingdom. This Roman question had been a deep wound in the national psyche. Mussolini, the former atheist, saw a historic opportunity. Through patient negotiation, he brokered an agreement that recognized Vatican City as a sovereign state, paid the Church a handsome indemnity, and made Catholicism the official state religion. It was a diplomatic masterstroke. It reconciled the state with the Church, bringing millions of Catholics firmly into the fascist fold and bestowing upon his regime a divine legitimacy that no amount of propaganda could have achieved on its own. For all the talk of revolution, Mussolini's rule was, in many ways, a pact with the old elites. He had saved the industrialists and landowners from the communists, and they in turn supported his regime. He had given the king his throne back in all but name, and the king in turn did nothing to oppose him. He had given the Pope his sovereignty, and the Church in turn praised him as a man of providence. This was the good of the fascist era, if such a term can be used. He had brought order where there was chaos. He had forged a national identity where there was division. He had, through sheer force of will, lifted Italy onto the world stage. But this order was the sterile order of a prison. The national identity was a hollow, militaristic myth. The price for this stability was freedom itself. The bad and the ugly were always there, lurking beneath the surface. The secret police, the political prisoners languishing on desolate islands, the silenced press, the fear that permeated every level of society, and the suffocating cult of personality that demanded not just obedience, but the surrender of the individual mind. It was a Faustian bargain with the nation's soul, and the bill was about to come due. The Duce, having made himself master of Italy, now began to look abroad, convinced that his will could reshape not just a nation, but the world. This ambition would lead him into the arms of a far more sinister ideologue and set him on a path to ruin.
His first arrest. The doors of the ambulance closed with a sickening finality, shutting out the Roman afternoon and the world Benito Mussolini had commanded for 21 years. At that moment, on July 25, 1943, he ceased to be Il Duce. He became a parcel, an object of immense political value and danger, to be hidden away from a nation that was erupting in spontaneous, delirious celebration of his downfall. He was dazed, uncomprehending. The king's words echoed in his mind, "You are the most hated man in Italy." After 2 decades of seeing his face adored on every wall, of hearing his name chanted by millions, the statement was so alien, so utterly disconnected from his reality, that he could not process it. His journey into captivity was a disorienting odyssey of secrecy. First, he was taken to a carabinieri barracks, then moved under the cover of darkness. He was a man without a destination, his fate in the hands of his former subordinate, Marshal Pietro Badoglio, who now led the new government. His captors were polite but firm, treating him with a surreal, detached correctness. He was put on a corvette and taken to the remote island of Ponza, a desolate speck in the Tyrrhenian Sea that his own regime had used for years as a prison for its political opponents. The irony was profound. He walked the same dusty paths as the men he had condemned, a ghost haunting his own penal system. But Ponza was deemed too vulnerable, too accessible to a potential rescue attempt by his German allies. He was moved again, this time to the island of La Maddalena, off the coast of Sardinia. All the while, the world he had built was being systematically dismantled. On September 8, 1943, the Badoglio government, which had been secretly negotiating with the Allies for weeks, publicly announced an armistice. For the Italian people, it was a moment of joyous relief, a belief that the war was finally over. It was a catastrophic illusion. For Adolf Hitler, Italy's unilateral surrender was the ultimate act of betrayal. He had anticipated it, and he reacted with swift and terrifying brutality. He launched Operation Axa. German forces, already positioned throughout the Italian peninsula, turned on their former allies. They disarmed the stunned and leaderless Italian army, sinking its warships, seizing its equipment, and shipping hundreds of thousands of its soldiers to labor camps in Germany. The Wehrmacht poured over the Alps, occupying Rome and all of northern and central Italy. The nation had not been liberated, it had merely swapped one master for another, far more ruthless one. In the midst of this chaos, Mussolini was moved one last time. He was flown to the mainland and taken to his final, most spectacular prison, the Campo Imperatore Hotel. It was a modern ski resort perched 7,000 feet up on the Gran Sasso Massif, the highest peak in the Apennines. Accessible only by a single funicular railway, it was a true eagle's nest. Here, Mussolini settled into a state of profound depression. The man who had lived his life in the full glare of the public eye was now utterly isolated, surrounded by 100 carabinieri guards, with only the silent, imposing peaks for company. His health, already poor, deteriorated rapidly. His stomach ulcer caused him agonizing pain. He lost weight, and his once imposing face became gaunt and hollow-eyed. He spent his days in a state of deep melancholy, staring out the window at the clouds swirling below, a man literally and figuratively above a world that had moved on without him. He was a prisoner of his own memories. He wrote, he read Goethe and Plato, and he reread his favorite work, Carducci's Odi Barbare, a collection of poems that celebrated the pagan, virile spirit of ancient Rome that he had tried so desperately to resurrect. He reflected on his downfall, not with introspection, but with a sense of bewilderment and self-pity. He blamed the treachery of his colleagues, the weakness of the king, the inherent flaws of the Italian character. He could not, or would not, see that the architect of his ruin was himself. He was a man confronting the wreckage of his life, a modern-day King Lear, raging against a storm of his own making on a lonely, wind-swept mountain. He did not know it, but his fate was now the subject of a fanatical obsession in the mind of the one man who still saw him as an indispensable ally.
His rescue by Hitler's army. In his smoke-filled headquarters at Rostenburg, the Wolf's Lair, Adolf Hitler flew into a rage upon hearing of Mussolini's arrest. To Hitler, loyalty was a supreme virtue, and the King of Italy's actions were an unforgivable betrayal. But his reaction was more than just anger. It was a matter of dire strategic and ideological importance. He could not allow the founder of fascism, his primary partner in the creation of a new European order, to be handed over to the Allies like a common criminal. The symbolic blow would be devastating.
Rescuing the Duce became a personal obsession, a mission of the highest priority. He summoned the best men in the Reich for the job. The task of locating the Duce was given to the SS in Rome, under the command of the cunning Herbert Kappler. The operational command for the rescue itself was given to General Kurt Student of the Luftwaffe, a pioneer of airborne operations. And to lead the commando team, Student chose a man who seemed physically sculpted for such a mission, the giant, scar-faced SS Hauptsturmführer, Otto Skorzeny. For weeks, German intelligence chased shadows. They followed false leads, monitored coded radio transmissions, and tried to piece together the puzzle of Mussolini's location. The secrecy surrounding his imprisonment was formidable. Finally, a German agent intercepted a coded Italian message that hinted at a prisoner of high importance being held in the Gran Sasso area. Aerial reconnaissance photographs confirmed that the Campo Imperatore Hotel was heavily guarded. The location had been found. The plan they devised was audacious to the point of being suicidal. A landing by parachute was impossible due to the thin mountain air and treacherous winds. A ground assault up the single funicular railway would be a bloody failure. General Student proposed a solution of breathtaking risk. They would land the commandos directly on the mountain plateau next to the hotel, using DFS-230 military gliders. These motorless aircraft would be towed into the air and released, gliding silently down to their target. The margin for error was non-existent. The landing zone was a short, uneven ski slope, not a runway. A slight miscalculation would send the gliders smashing into the rocks or tumbling into the abyss. On the morning of September 12, 1943, 12 gliders were towed into the sky from an airfield near Rome. Inside, Skorzeny and his SS commandos, along with a contingent of paratroopers, sat in grim silence. As they were released from their tow planes, an eerie quiet descended, broken only by the whistling of the wind. Below them, the Gran Sasso Massif rose like a jagged island from a sea of clouds. The landing was a controlled crash. The first glider came in too fast and smashed to pieces, but the men inside survived. Skorzeny's glider slammed down on the rocky ground just 100 yards from the hotel, skidding to a violent halt. Within seconds, he and his men were out, screaming and running towards the building, their machine guns blazing, not to kill, but to shock and intimidate. The Italian Carabinieri guards were taken by complete surprise. They had been assured that their prisoner was safe, that no one would dare to attempt a rescue in such an impossible location. Faced with the sudden appearance of elite German commandos, their will to fight evaporated. An Italian general, brought along by the Germans to prevent bloodshed, ordered them not to fire. Skorzeny smashed through the main entrance, his men close behind. He ran up the stairs, kicking down doors, until he found a room with 2 guards outside. He burst in. There, standing by a window, was Benito Mussolini. He was thin, pale, and looked years older than he had just 2 months prior. He saw the towering Skorzeny in his German uniform and asked simply, "Do I know you?" Skorzeny stood at attention. "Duce, the Führer has sent me. You are free." Mussolini was overwhelmed, a mixture of relief and weary resignation washing over his face. He walked to the window and saw the German soldiers overpowering his guards. He said, "I knew that my friend Adolf Hitler would not abandon me," as much to himself as to Skorzeny. The most dangerous part of the mission was still to come, the extraction. A tiny, light Fieseler Storch reconnaissance plane had managed to land on the plateau. It was a plane designed for a pilot and perhaps 1 passenger. Skorzeny, a man of well over 6 feet and 200 pounds, insisted on cramming himself into the plane alongside Mussolini and the pilot.
The overloaded aircraft teetered dangerously on the edge of the cliff as the pilot revved the engine. It bumped and bounced along the short, rocky strip, dipped precariously over the edge of the abyss, and then, miraculously, caught the air and began to climb. They had done the impossible. The eagle had snatched the fallen falcon from his cage. That evening, a weary Mussolini was flown to Vienna, and from there to Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia. He was a free man, but he would soon discover that he had merely exchanged one prison for another.
The reunion at the Wolf's Lair was a study in contrasts. Hitler was ecstatic, greeting Mussolini with a triumphant embrace. He hailed the rescue as a testament to the unbreakable bond of their two revolutions. But the man he embraced was not the Duce he remembered. Mussolini was a ghost, a stooped, frail figure in an ill-fitting suit, his face a mask of exhaustion and despair. Hitler quickly disabused him of any notion that he could now retire from politics. The Führer was incandescent with rage at what he deemed the ultimate betrayal by the House of Savoy and the Italian military. He laid out his demands in no uncertain terms. Mussolini was to return to Italy, establish a new fascist republic, and wage a total war against the traitors who had sided with the Allies. He was to punish, with merciless severity, those who had deposed him. Mussolini, a man physically and psychologically broken, a man who yearned for a quiet retirement, had no choice. He was a pawn in Hitler's grand strategy, his life and reputation now entirely dependent on German arms. And so the Italian Social Republic, RSI, was born. It was a phantom state, a regime born of German resentment and Italian shame. Lacking control of Rome, its capital was scattered across the towns of northern Italy, with its administrative heart in the small resort town of Salo, on the shores of Lake Garda, a name that would become synonymous with the final ugly chapter of fascism. Mussolini himself was a shadow ruler. He was installed in a villa, heavily protected by an SS guard, his communications monitored, his actions dictated by the German ambassador, Rudolf Rahn. His new government was populated by a collection of die-hard fascist ideologues and second-rate opportunists. His two sons, Vittorio and Romano, were with him, but the heart of his family was missing. His wife Rachele was in another location, and his beloved daughter, Edda, the wife of Galeazzo Ciano, was soon to become the protagonist in the regime's most agonizing tragedy. Hitler's demand for vengeance had to be met. A special tribunal was established in Verona in January 1944 to try the members of the Fascist Grand Council who had voted against Mussolini on that fateful July night. Most of them had wisely fled, but the Germans had managed to capture 6, including the elderly Marshal de Bono and, most significantly, Galeazzo Ciano. The Verona trial was a macabre piece of political theater. Ciano, who had been lured back to Italy by a false promise of safety, defended himself with dignity. He argued that his vote had been a political act, not treason, an attempt to save the nation from a war that Mussolini himself knew was lost. But the verdict was a foregone conclusion dictated from Berlin. All the defendants were found guilty of treason and sentenced to death. This presented Mussolini with a truly Shakespearean dilemma. His daughter, Edda, a fierce and strong-willed woman, pleaded desperately with her father to save her husband. She possessed Ciano's secret diaries, explosive documents that detailed the cynical inner workings of the Axis alliance and were deeply embarrassing to Hitler. She tried to use them as a bargaining chip, threatening to release them to the Allies. But the Germans were adamant. The traitors had to die. Trapped between his love for his daughter and his absolute subservience to Hitler, Mussolini made his choice. He sacrificed his family to maintain his political existence. On the morning of January 11, 1944, Galeazzo Ciano and 4 others were executed by a firing squad. They were tied to chairs, facing away from their killers, a final act of humiliation. Ciano is said to have twisted around at the last second to look his executioners in the eye. The execution of his own son-in-law marked the final death of Mussolini's soul. He became a recluse, a bitter, hollowed-out man going through the motions of leadership. His speeches, broadcast over the radio, lacked their old fire.
They were the rambling, vengeful tirades of an old man obsessed with betrayal. Meanwhile, the territory he supposedly ruled descended into a hellish civil war. The Slow Republic was a place of unimaginable brutality. Its small, fanatical military force, the Black Brigades, alongside the SS and the Gestapo, waged a savage war against the Italian partisan resistance. The partisans, supplied by the Allies and fueled by a mixture of patriotism and anti-fascist ideology, grew stronger by the day, controlling vast swaths of the mountainous countryside. The war became a cycle of assassination and reprisal. For every German soldier or fascist official killed by the partisans, the Germans would execute 10 Italian civilians. The massacre at the Ardeatine Caves in Rome in March 1944, where 335 Italian hostages were shot in the back of the head, was only the most infamous of these atrocities. The Slow Republic was not a state, it was a slaughterhouse, and Mussolini was its haunted, powerless warden. For 18 months, this agony continued as the Allied armies slowly and bloodily fought their way up the Italian peninsula.
The Day of Reckoning. The spring of 1945 brought with it the death rattle of the Third Reich and its Italian satellite state. The Allied armies, having breached the formidable Gothic line, were now pouring into the Po Valley. The German war machine in Italy, starved of fuel and reinforcements, was disintegrating. For the Italian partisan movement, this was the signal they had been waiting for. On April 25th, the Committee of National Liberation for Upper Italy, CLNAI, ordered a general insurrection. In Milan, Turin, Genoa, and 100 other towns and cities, partisans emerged from the mountains and the shadows, overwhelming the remaining fascist and German garrisons. The Republic of Salo, which had never been more than a German occupation with an Italian face, simply ceased to exist. Mussolini was in Milan, his world shrinking by the hour to the confines of the city's prefecture. The last days of his rule were a frantic, chaotic blur of delusion and despair. He held court with a dwindling entourage of loyalists, receiving fantastical reports of phantom fascist armies ready to fight to the death. His last meaningful political act was a meeting with partisan leaders, brokered by the Archbishop of Milan, Cardinal Schuster. He hoped to negotiate a civilized surrender that would spare his followers from reprisals and guarantee his own safety. But the partisans demanded unconditional surrender. When Mussolini discovered that the local German command was simultaneously negotiating its own surrender behind his back, he exploded in a final impotent rage. Feeling betrayed on all sides, he abandoned the talks and chose flight. His escape plan was a fantasy. He spoke of making a last stand in the Valtellina, a remote alpine valley, but no preparations had been made. His true destination was the Swiss border. On the rainy evening of April 25th, he fled Milan in a convoy of cars, carrying his remaining ministers and a cache of gold and secret documents. With him was the one person who had refused to abandon him, his mistress of 13 years, Claretta Petacci. Her devotion was absolute, a tragic and unwavering constant in the chaos of his collapse. She was not a political fanatic. Her commitment was entirely personal. She saw not the failed dictator, but the man she loved, a man she believed had been wronged by a treacherous world. He had pleaded with her to save herself, to escape to Spain, but she had refused. Her place, she insisted, was by his side, whatever the cost. Her presence transformed his squalid political end into a human tragedy. The small convoy of fugitives headed north toward Lake Como. Desperate for protection, they joined a large German anti-aircraft column that was also retreating towards the Alps. It was here, on the western shore of the lake, that Mussolini sealed his fate with a final, pathetic act of disguise. He pulled on the greatcoat and helmet of a German Luftwaffe soldier and climbed into the back of a Wehrmacht truck. On the afternoon of Friday, April 27, 1945, the column was halted by a roadblock manned by the 52nd Garibaldi Partisan Brigade, commanded by Count Pierluigi Bellini delle Stelle. The partisans were firm. The Germans could proceed, but no Italians could pass. A meticulous, man-by-man search of the trucks began. A young partisan commissar named Urbano Lazzaro peered into the dark interior of one of the trucks. He saw a man slumped on a bench, a helmet pulled down low, a coat collar pulled up high, feigning a drunken slumber. But the man was not German, and under the coat Lazzaro caught a glimpse of the distinctive striped trousers of a fascist official. Another partisan, Giuseppe Negri, looked closer, and his blood ran cold. He recognized the unmistakable jawline, the broad face, even in its puffy, defeated state. "Excellency," he exclaimed, the honorific slipping out from years of habit. The game was up. Benito Mussolini, the Duce of Italy, was a prisoner. He was taken to the town hall in Dongo, where he was held under guard. That night, after Claretta Petacci was also detained, the local partisan commander, fearing a rescue or lynching attempt, decided to move them to a more secure location. They were taken across the lake and then driven up a winding road to a small remote farmhouse belonging to a peasant family named De Maria. Here, in a simple bedroom with a crucifix on the wall, Benito and Claretta spent their last night together. They were given a sparse meal. He was, by turns, resigned and delusional, speaking of his place in history, of the crowds that had once adored him. She was terrified but resolute, her only concern to comfort the man to whom she had given her life. But their fate was already sealed. The CLNAI in Milan had issued a death warrant. There would be no trial. The long and bloody account of fascism was to be closed. A communist partisan and former factory worker named Walter Audicio, using the code name Colonel Valerio, was sent from Milan with a small team and a terrible, unalterable mandate. On the sweltering afternoon of Saturday, April 28, 1945, Valerio burst into the De Maria farmhouse. He was a man possessed by a cold, righteous fury. He told Mussolini and Petacci they were being rescued. They were hurried into a waiting black Fiat. The short drive ended abruptly in the small village of Giulino di Mezzegra, in front of the ornate iron gate of the Villa Belmonte. The spot was chosen for its seclusion. They were ordered out of the car. It was only then, as he was pushed against the low stone wall beside the gate, that Mussolini finally understood the true nature of his rescue. His mask of stoicism crumbled, revealing a flash of raw fear. Yet some vestige of the old Duce remained. He puffed out his chest and declared, "Shoot me in the chest." Valerio raised his French submachine gun. He pulled the trigger. Nothing happened. The gun had jammed. In a moment of high historical drama that descended into absurd, horrifying farce, Valerio struggled with the weapon, then cast it aside and drew his pistol. It, too, misfired. He ripped a different submachine gun from the hands of his second-in-command. As he took aim, Claretta Petacci screamed his name, "Benito!" and in a final, futile act of love, threw herself in front of him, trying to shield his body with her own. The burst of gunfire was brutally efficient. Claretta was hit first and crumpled to the ground. Mussolini was struck by a volley of 9 bullets, collapsing beside her. The man who had held Italy in his grip for a generation, who had dreamed of resurrecting the Roman Empire, lay dead in a heap of blood and dust on a quiet country roadside. But the story was not quite over. There was one final, gruesome epilogue. The bodies of Mussolini, Petacci, and 16 other executed fascist leaders were loaded on a removal van and driven to Milan. In the early hours of April 29th, they were dumped in Piazzale Loreto, the very square where, 8 months earlier, fascists had publicly displayed the bodies of 15 executed partisans. As dawn broke, a crowd gathered, a crowd that grew into a vast, enraged mob. They kicked the bodies, spat on them, and cursed them. In a final, spontaneous act of public exorcism, the bodies of Mussolini, Petacci, and several others were hoisted by their ankles and hung from the steel girder of a Standard Oil gas station that overlooked the square. There they hung, for hours, a grotesque spectacle of dangling flesh, a medieval display of popular fury. The roaring crowds of the Palazzo Venezia had been replaced by the jeering mob of the Piazzale Loreto. The opera had reached its bloody and definitive conclusion.